Let's talk about how the island of Themyscira works in my DC cinematic universe. Yesterday I talked about how Atlantis worked and how it was related to the downfall of worship of the Greek pantheon, and Themyscira works exactly the same way. The Amazons were a huge, powerful, global army of women that all worshipped the female gods of the Greek pantheon. And just as Atlantis was attacked for their prosperity, the Amazons were attacked for their own. And so all of the Amazon army in its entirety was moved to this island, and then all of the Greek goddesses, including Aphrodite, who is a member of the Endless and nigh omnipotent, all working together, imbued every single Amazon with immortality. It was a reward for not only their devotion, but for their just souls. A magical veil being thrown over the island so that the outside world of man could never find it. Over the centuries, a little bit of infighting developed, and so some groups splintered off from the main island of Themyscira, establishing the Amazonian tribes from the comics. And per their agreement with the Greek goddesses, any Amazonian woman who wanted to have a child was welcome to go out into the world of man to conceive one. But once the child was born, if it was male, it had to be left in the world of man. Only female children could return to the Isle of Themyscira and eventually be granted their own immortality. But one day, the general of the Amazon army, the queen of Themyscira, Hippolyta, wanted a child of her own. But not only did she not want to lay with a man to get one, she also didn't want to chance it being born a male and her having to give up her own child. So she prayed to the goddesses for a child. And Hera, the goddess of childbirth and family, granted Hippolyta her wish. Hippolyta grew pregnant. Essentially, it was magical immaculate conception. But because Hippolyta has always been an incredibly faithful follower to Hera and all of the Greek goddesses, and the Greek goddesses remained worshipped to this day by Hippolyta and her followers, Hera decided to grant the child more gifts. Over the centuries, all of the gods had come to really like Hippolyta, and so many of them contributed gifts to Hippolyta's future daughter. Zeus granted the future daughter the power of his children. When she was born, she would be as strong as any demigod he'd ever sired. Hermes granted her his own speed. Demeter granted the girl with a green thumb. Hephaestus smithed a magical set of armor that would grow with the girl, was nearly indestructible, and gave her a magical golden lasso that when wrapped around people would force them to tell the truth. Aphrodite, being one of the most powerful members of this pantheon, granted the girl immortality and beauty everlasting. Apollo granted her super healing, Artemis granted her hunting ability, and Athena granted her wisdom to speak any language she ever heard and mastery of tactics. 9 months later, the little girl was born. Her name was Diana, and she was destined to be one of the greatest heroes the universe will ever know. Let's talk about the tribes of the Amazons in my DC cinematic universe. Starting off, we have the original tribe. This is the original group of the female warriors and female followers of basically all of the female gods of the Greek pantheon. After the fall of the Greek gods, these women were sent to a private island and granted immortality for their faith. But eventually this solitary life on the island didn't really sit well with everyone, and so some groups splintered off. One group, consisting of some of the African members of the Amazonians, decided to go back to their homeland, and they started the Dahomey Tribe. Now, they still maintained the no contact with men part of the Amazonian philosophy, but they would teach some of the native women of Africa how to fight, and those women would then go on to form the Dahomey Tribe that actually exists in the real world. Another splinter group that left the island of Themyscira was a group known as the Venturians. These women craved a little bit more of a militaristic regime, and so they all left not even 100 years after Themyscira was formed. And then we have the Brazilian tribe of Amazons known as the Esquisita. These women moved to South America and called the Amazon rainforest their home. And finally, we have a group known as the Bana Migdal. The Bana Migdal were a splinter group that left a couple hundred years ago because they were upset with the trade-off of an infinite lifetime of solitude for their worship of the Greek gods. They didn't think that was a fair trade. So instead, they just left. They eventually settled near Egypt. They integrated into society, but never revealed that they were an immortal group of warriors. And instead, they would become a famous band of mercenaries. And all of these tribes have their corresponding leaders. Themyscira is run by Queen Hippolyta, whose daughter and princess of Themyscira is Diana. The Dahomey tribe are run by Queen Zahava and her daughter, Princess Nubia. The Venturians are run by their queen Clea. The Esquisita are run by Queen Ayla, and she has very recently had a daughter with a local Brazilian river god, and that daughter's name is Yara Flor. And finally, the Bana Migdal, run by Queen Antiope. She is the younger sister of Queen Hippolyta. And in my DC Cinematic Universe, her daughter is Artemis. And those are the tribes of the Amazons in my DC Cinematic Universe. Let's talk about Queen Ayla and Yara Flor in my DC Cinematic Universe. Queen Ayla is the head of the Esquisita tribe of the Amazons. This group left only a couple hundred years ago after the New World was discovered. They sailed across the seas and they found South America, and eventually they found the Amazon River and the Amazon rainforest. These few women who came over from Themyscira eventually welcomed the native women of the local region into their tribe, and thus the Esquisita were born. The Esquisita still followed the rule that they could go out and have a child with a man out in the world, and if it was born a girl, they could bring it back to the tribe. Well, Queen Ayla still did this, but the man that she had met was actually a local god. He was specifically one of the gods of the great Amazon River. They had a daughter together, and she named her Yara Flor. And she inherited powers from her father, such as super strength and super speed. She wields a set of golden bolas, and she has a flying pet Pegasus named Jerry. She would be the representative chosen by the Esquisita to join Diana's crusade to find the rogue Venturian Amazonians, who, after the death of the Greek gods, are now setting their sights to invade the world of man. Let's talk about Queen Zahava and her daughter Nubia in my DC Cinematic Universe. Queen Zahava and Princess Nubia are the heads of the Dahomey Tribe of the Amazonians. Their group was largely consisting of the African members of the Amazonians to begin with, and they just really wanted to go back home. And so they did. They left the island of Themyscira and established their own hidden nation within Africa. They maintained most of the laws held by the Amazonians of Themyscira, but they would take native women and train them how to fight. And some of the women that they had trained how to fight decided not to join their tribe, but instead leave and pass this knowledge on to the women outside of the area. And those women would go on and keep the name of this tribe, the Dahomey. And the Dahomey are an actual real group of women, basically called the African Amazons. Their history is awesome as shit. Highly recommend a Google. And eventually Queen Zahava would want a child of her own, and so she would go out, she would have sex with a man of the local area, and later she would have a daughter, and she would name that daughter Nubia. Nubia would grow into a great warrior, even rivaling the skill of Diana of Themyscira. And she and Diana would become best friends. They regard each other as sisters. And she would be the representative chosen by the Dahomey to join Diana to hunt down the Venturian Amazons. Let's talk about the Bana Migdal in my DC Cinematic Universe. The Bana Migdal are a group of Amazonians splintered off from Themyscira, led by Antiope, the younger sister of Queen Hippolyta of Themyscira. Over the centuries, Antiope would grow more and more disenchanted by the Greek gods. She believed that an infinite lifetime of isolation wasn't a fair trade-off for their worship. And so she took her most loyal followers and they left Themyscira to go live out in the world of man. Now, the difference with these women is that they didn't start a hidden society anywhere. They just lived in society and kept bouncing around. These women were incredibly proud of the fighting prowess and power granted to them by the gods. And they didn't just want to sit around not using it, and so they became a roving gang of mercenaries. The Bana Migdal are a publicly known group, but the rest of the world just thinks this is a group of mercenaries consisting entirely of women. They do not know that this is a group of immortal, superpowered women. And eventually, even Queen Antiope would want a daughter of her own. And she simply just walked out one night, walked into a bar, chose a dude at random, and had a kid with him. And that daughter would grow to be Artemis. And Artemis is the representative that the Bana Migdal choose to join Diana to hunt down the rogue Venturian Amazons. Let's talk about the Venturians and Queen Clea in my DC Cinematic Universe. Clea and the rest of the Venturians that left Themyscira craved military hierarchy. While some women on the island of Themyscira were allowed to pursue things other than combat, such as music or art, these women wanted all of their society to solely focus on fighting and military strategy. And so Clea, who was the leader of this movement, took everyone most loyal to her, and they left Themyscira to start their own civilization, Venturia. And after the events of my first Wonder Woman movie, where all of the Greek gods die, Queen Clea would find an alternative to keep her Amazons immortal. You see, in the laws of the Amazons, they are allowed to go out and have sex with a dude to have a kid. But if that kid is born male, they have to leave it behind. Well, because the Amazonians did this not infrequently, there inevitably became a group of men who traveled the world looking for their immortal warrior mothers. And Clea would eventually learn about those men. And so for the past 500 years, Clea has been locating and enslaving the sons of the Amazons, using dark magics granted to her by the still alive goddess of magic Hecate. Clea was draining these men of their life essence and transferring it into her own soldiers. Queen Clea and the Venturian Amazons are the main antagonists of my second Wonder Woman movie, as they are going out into the world of man to invade and enslave anyone who should turn against them so that she can keep her followers immortal now that the Greek gods that granted them their original immortality are dead.